Thank you so much for being here tonight. So this is a two-parter. The first hour, we're going to talk about an effort to consolidate our elections to even years. And then the second part will be about the budget. We're lucky to have with us Chris Meyer, our city clerk, who really is probably the leading expert on elections in the state of Arizona. We're pretty lucky to have him. I personally think he's probably the most knowledgeable, probably even more knowledgeable than our Secretary of State and our county recorder. Not that they don't do a good job, but he's been doing this for years. So he's put together a little presentation to go through what we're trying to propose at the city. So take it away, Chris.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Thank you for being here. Small crowd, so we'll go through the information on the presentation, and then should have plenty of time for questions. First, a little background on city elections. The city of Phoenix is the second largest election jurisdiction in the state, second only to Maricopa County. So we have more registered voters than even Pima County, the second largest county. And Phoenix, because our elections are nonpartisan at the city, the elections have been conducted separately from the state and the county elections all the way back to incorporation since 1881. And we changed our elections from the spring to the fall of odd years back in 1949, and they've been in the fall of odd years since then. Phoenix has 713,000 registered voters, and about 70% of those are on the permanent early voting list, which means they get a notice and then they will be automatically mailed a ballot for each election in which they're eligible to vote, with one caveat that we'll talk a little bit about in a few minutes. And in city elections, 95% or more of ballots cast, the people who actually vote in the election, vote by mail. That's been the norm for the last several elections. And it's been climbing since 1991, when you no longer had to sign an affidavit that you were going to be out of your precinct on election day to be able to vote by mail. It was called absentee voting back then. City's been a leader in innovations in elections in Arizona and even really around the country. Phoenix was one of the first jurisdictions to consolidate precincts to reduce some of the polling places with fewer people going there back in 1987. And then we established the first permanent early voting list in the state in 1997. The state followed in 2007 with the statewide permanent early voting list. And then we were the first to develop and use voting centers in 2011, and now there's some other counties that do that as well. The City Council has been considering options to consolidate elections, and there's really three proposals that we'll be looking at tonight. They all have pros and cons, depending on your perspective, which are the pros and which are the cons, but there are pros and cons to all three of them. The first would be to maintain the current August-November election cycle in odd years, with the city conducting the elections. The second would be to consolidate with the state and county elections and federal elections in the fall of even years, so the primary and state general elections in the fall of even years. The third would be to have our first election in the November of even years with the state general election, and then have a runoff election when necessary in the following March, which is the next available date under state law that we can hold an election. Now, any of the options to consolidate will require some charter amendments that would have to go to the voters for approval. And so the City Council is looking at possibly referring those to the voters in the fall of 2018, which would allow us then to consolidate our scheduled candidate elections that are coming up in 2019, could move to 2020 and be consolidated with the state general election in 2020 when the governor would be up for election. So I'm going to quickly go over the three options and kind of what they look like, and then we'll go back through each one and talk about some of the details and some of the pros and cons on them. So the current cycle, or the current method, is the fall of odd years, and the city conducts those elections. City of Phoenix conducts the elections. We get the voter registration totals from Maricopa County, and they verify some kinds of provisional ballots, but we pretty much do everything else ourselves. We're independent of the county. The permanent early voting list is used for early voting, and all of the voters on that permanent early voting list get a ballot. Because we're nonpartisan, we don't have the issue with anybody having to select a party, so everyone gets their ballot. We use voting centers instead of polling places. We started that in 2011, and any voter can go to any voting center, and they can vote on Saturday, Monday, or Tuesday. They are not limited to one place and limited to the one day, election day. The dates, the city's August election is really our general election, because we have a general and runoff system for our election. So the general is in August. If any candidate gets a majority of the votes cast, they're elected in August. If they don't, the top 2 vote getters go to a runoff in November. But a runoff is not needed 40% of the time, and for 70% of our candidate races. 70% of them are actually decided without a runoff. So having this system of the August general and November runoff, we put the propositions in the first ballot. The second election is either avoided or reduced, unless we have just one district runoff or whatever we have the runoff. So it saves the money of a second citywide election. And the cost, all of the cost information you'll see tonight is based on a citywide election. Obviously, if it's only one district or a part of the city, then the cost is lower. But for comparison purposes, it's all citywide. And so the cost for the city to conduct a voting center election is about $1 million. Second option would be moving to the state primary general elections in even years in the fall. The county would conduct those elections, and our items would just go on the county ballot for the primary and the general election. The county uses the permanent early voting list for both the August primary and for November. But because the primary election in August is a partisan election, partisan primary election, where voters that are members of the parties are electing candidates to be on the ballot in November, there is an issue for independents on the permanent early voting list that we'll talk a little bit more. They do not automatically get a ballot. They have to select the party that they want because of the open primaries. And the polling places are used by the county, traditional polling places, so you go to the one place designated for your precinct for you to vote in, and it's on election day on Tuesday. Again, it's in August and November of even years, which is when the president, the governor, and the state ballot, state primary in general, with the judges and all the other items on the ballot. And a county election, if we consolidated, would cost about $500,000. So it does save money when we consolidate, because all of the jurisdictions on the ballot share the cost along with the county and the state. So the city shares about $500,000 for a consolidated election. The third option is November and March. So the November election would be in even years with the state general election, but a runoff, if necessary, would be the following March in the spring. So the county would conduct the election in the fall, in November, and the city items would be on the general election ballot. And then the city would conduct the election in March if there was a runoff election, and we would use voting centers for that election. Again, the permanent early voting list would be used by the county in November, and since it's not a primary election and not a partisan election specifically, all the voters on the permanent early voting list would receive a ballot for the November general election. The people who are independents would still receive their ballot for the general. One of the advantages of this option is the turnout in November elections is higher. For whatever reason, there's not a lot of turnout and participation in local elections. It's not only the city of Phoenix, it's a statewide and really a national trend that voters tend to turn out more and show up and participate in the statewide general elections and to some extent the primary elections, but not in local elections. It's true for school districts, cities and towns, as I said, pretty much all over the country. The election would be in November of even years and the March runoff in odd years. And a county polling place election, the first one in November for the consolidated would cost about $500,000. The city doing a voting center election, if it was a citywide in March, would be about $1 million again. So now we'll look at each one and talk about a few of the pros and cons on each of them. First, in the current method, conducted by the city in August and November of odd years. This keeps the city nonpartisan elections off of the partisan ballots. So you don't have the mix-up with the nonpartisan and partisan, and you don't have the issue with permanent early voting list independents not getting their ballot. The city mails them to everybody. There are 500,000 registered voters on the permanent early voting list in Phoenix. So we mail about 500,000 ballots out, and about a third of those ballots come back. So only about a third get voted and returned for local elections. Again, people tend to not participate in the local elections even when the ballot is mailed to them, and they just need to mark it and send it back for a variety of reasons probably. Again, we'd be using the voting centers, and the runoff is not needed most of the time, so we would have only the one election in August, And then we might have a runoff election in one district or two districts. We've only had one citywide runoff since 1991 when we went to the staggered term. So only one time did we have a citywide runoff. And again, the cost for a citywide voting center election is about $1 million. For the second option, the county conducting the election as part of the primary and general in the fall of even years. The August, again, is the partisan primary election. So members of the parties, or you're voting by party to select the candidates for that party, and the winners then appear on the November ballot. So for independents, because we have the open primary law, independents are eligible to vote in those primary elections, but they have to tell the election officer which party ballot they want. They can request the Republican ballot or a Democratic ballot or the independent ballot, the Libertarian ballot, but they have to select the ballot or they won't be mailed a ballot because the county doesn't know which one to send them. And if the voters do receive, they have the option of a party ballot or a nonpartisan city ballot. So it has just the nonpartisan races on it if they want to select that. But if they do select that and vote it, then they will not be able to vote in the party one, change their mind to vote in the party, because they will have already voted all the rest of the items on the ballot. And the party, all the items are on the partisan ballot. So again, this is when the elections for the governor or the president rotate on 2 years, the state legislative offices, the judges, the county. It's a long ballot. There's a lot of items on there. And so one of the issues with this option is that although in August there's a fair amount of space on the ballot to put propositions, we can probably put 4 to 6 with a medium amount of description of the propositions on the ballot. Whereas on the city, about 90% of the ballot space is available for propositions and descriptions. So there's more room for more measures, and there's more space to put the description on the ballot and have more information about the proposition on the ballot. In the general election, it's even more restricted. County estimates that there could maybe be 2 to 4 propositions on that ballot, and you're pretty much limited to 50 words that just is the title of what the item is and a yes or no vote. So very limited space on the November ballot. So the advantage here, people know there's election, everybody knows about the state general election, but there's not as much room to put things on, and it's a long ballot for voters to have to get through and to identify the issues and prepare for all those issues. So there may be less information available to voters on the local races with this consolidation, because most of the attention will be on the president and the government and statewide ballot measures and all the other candidates on the ballot. This illustrates the issue with the independents. In the August election, the numbers up here for the last 2 county primary elections in 2016 and 2014 show that there were about 400,000 voters, independent voters in the county that received this notice to select a ballot for which party they wanted. But you see very few of them actually returned it and got a ballot by mail. In 2016, only 15%, and in 2014, about 19% actually requested a ballot. So the rest of those voters did not request and did not receive a ballot by mail. They would have had to have gone to the polls and voted, or they would have had to have sent a separate request in to get a ballot by mail at this point, so they wouldn't have gotten it automatically. Whereas you see in comparison, the city, there's 148,000 permanent early voting list independents in Phoenix, and all 148,000 of them, 100%, would have been sent a ballot for that election if they would have received it. Now, we did look to see what happened as far as turnout, and about 20 to 25% of the independents that received those ballots voted them and returned them. Here's an illustration of the turnout with comparing the city elections in the fall of odd years to the primary election in August of even years when the county conducts it. And you'll see that there's not really much difference in turnout for the primary elections. The real driving factor in elections and turnout is what's on the ballot, how contested the races are, how controversial the ballot measures are, and how much attention they get is really what drives turnout. But in the city elections, you're in the 20 to 23% range, and for the county, you're about 23 to 25. So there may be a % or 2 increase in the August election. But again, in the August election, you have the issue with the independents not getting the ballot. So because there's the issue with the independents on the Peeble and the turnout not being much different, the council is considering a third option to try to get around those 2 concerns. And that's the issue of a November and March as again, the county would conduct the election in November and the city, the runoff in March if there were one. This solves the issue of, in a general election, everybody gets the ballot because the Democrats and Republicans and Libertarians are all on the general election ballot. There's one or two depending on the race from each party. Again, the cost would be only $500,000, but and the voting center, when we do it in March, it was citywide, would be $1 million. One of the disadvantages to this November-March cycle is that you have 5 months of campaign cycle between the November election and then anybody that goes to a runoff. It's not for 5 months. And for those of you who love campaign signs, they can all remain up during that period of time. And then the other thing that's been mentioned as a concern is with the March runoff, you may have good turnout in November because that tends to be the highest turnout, as we'll see in a moment. But in the March election, it's completely off cycle now, so the turnout may even be lower than what we're used to getting in our regular fall of odd year elections. Again, turnout largely depends on how contested the race is and how interested people are, but the timing is a factor, obviously. Here's a graph that shows the turnout in the November elections, and you can see the city at 28, 29%. For the presidential election, 74% of Phoenix voters. Now, this is just Phoenix voters who voted in the presidential election, who voted in the city election. And then 23% in our November 2013 runoff election, and the governor's election that year, 43%. But you'll notice there's a 30% difference between presidential elections and the governor's and state races. And then in 2015, there was no city runoff. We talked about 70% of the time for the offices there aren't any, and 40% of the elections don't have to go to a runoff. There wasn't one in 2015. Everyone's elected in August, so there was none in November. And then with the presidential election in 2016, about 71% of the voters in Phoenix participated. Okay, there are several charter amendments that would be required, as I said, to implement this. And the council is considering referring those to voters in the fall. And that's one of the reasons we're out getting this input on what voters think, what they would like to see referred to the voters, if anything, to change the elections and what model they prefer. So some of the charter amendments that include changing the terms, obviously, changing the date of the elections, because you have to align the terms with the new election date. And the election dates are in our charter, so we would have to adjust those. So that's the basic information on the three options. I'd be glad to take any questions, answer any questions you have, or provide any other information. Any questions? Dan? Here, let me give you the mic so that they can hear you on the video.
I was wondering if you can explain why current elected officials' terms would have to be extended by a year.
Sorry, I didn't know that.
Should I try a different question?
No, you can try the same one.
Okay,
So now we know the protocol. If you have a question, you can come up to the vote.
okay, so my question is if you could explain
Why current elected official terms would have to be extended by a year to implement, I guess it'd be options 2 or 3.
Okay, question is, as you heard, why would the terms need to be extended? Well, we're going to move the election date from 2019 to 2020, which is a year. The terms are based on when the election occurs. So right now, the terms run out in January of 2020 because of the election in 2019. So if the election is not going to turn until 2020, you'd have nobody in office for a year. So something has to be done with those terms. And there is a bill pending at the legislature at the moment that would address this, another consolidation bill, and it extends the terms of existing officials a year. That is what happened when the state consolidated elections a few years ago, when most of the cities and towns that were not charter cities and towns all moved to the August-November ballot. The terms were mostly extended. There was one jurisdiction that shortened them because they went from the spring back to the fall.
And that was my question. Respectfully, that's why they need to be adjusted by a year, not why they have to be extended by a year. They could be shortened by a year if this is just about voter turnout, correct?
It is possible that terms could be shortened. We've looked into that. There's some questions about it, but it wouldn't be able to happen in 2019 because they've already been elected to a term. We would have to delay the implementation to 2022. And then they could run for a shorter term in 2019.
Thanks.
Yes.
I'm Nancy Craney, known as Frosty. Would you re-explain in slow terms the second option where the independent voters would get to vote on some things but would not get to vote on other things? I didn't quite understand that.
Sure, be glad to. Wants to explain the issue for the independents on the Peeble in the elections in the even-numbered years. I guess this is one of the best slides to show it. Arizona, the primary election in August is a party election. So you request either a Republican ballot, a Democratic ballot, a independent, well, not an independent, I mean a libertarian ballot, or a nonpartisan ballot. Those are the options in Maricopa available that you can select. Independents in Arizona, in other words, all the voters who are not registered as a member of one of the parties that are on the ballot, recognized parties. Independent voters in Arizona, we have open primaries. So independent voters can vote in the primary elections for the party. They can request a Republican ballot, even though they're an independent, or they can request the Democratic ballot or the Libertarian ballot, and they can vote those. If they don't want those, they can select a ballot that has all the other things on it. But because those voters are not registered as a member of a party, the election officials don't know which ballot to send them. So those voters get a postcard from the county along with all the people on the preliminary voting list, but it tells them, hey, tell us which one you want, and we will then mail the ballot. That's the chart that I had up there that showed that only 15% and 18% of the voters in the last two elections of the independents sent that back to get a ballot. Most of them didn't have the ballot mailed to them or didn't respond to it. So in the party election, the election officials can't mail them a ballot because they don't know which one to send them. Whereas in the city election, which is nonpartisan, and like the general election in November for the state, everybody gets the ballot because there's only one ballot. Did that help? So it's not that the independents can't vote or can't get a ballot, it's just that they have to request and tell them which one to send them, because there's 4 options, and because they're independents, they're able to pick which one they want to vote in. And if they don't pick, there's nothing that authorizes an election official to mail out a ballot that they didn't request.
But they would still get a city ballot.
No, they wouldn't, because the city items would be consolidated to the county ballot. They would not get any ballot unless they requested one. Now, they could request the city-only ballot, and then they would get that ballot, but they'd still have to request that. So they get a postcard, and they would have to mark it, and it gives them option, it gives the 4 boxes on there. They mark it and return it, and then get the ballot. Or they can call in, or they can go online. But they do have to tell them which ballot they want in order to get one. Because if they just mailed the nonpartisan ballot to all the independents, if any of them wanted to vote in the party, then they can't do it because they've already voted most of the races on the ballot. So they've already voted, they wouldn't be able to do it.
So this doesn't do anything to change the fact that you have to choose. How about write-ins?
It wouldn't change write-ins. Write-ins would work the same for the elections. If there's write-in candidates for the city, there'd be a list at the polling places that showed, or the voting centers, that showed who the write-in candidates were, and they write them in, and then the county tabulates those just like they do for other write-ins. Okay? But the change is uniquely to the partisan primary elections. Independents aren't a member of one of the parties, so they have to identify which ballot they want. And if they don't identify, they can't mail them the ballot. They're still eligible to vote. They can go to the polls and they can pick there, or they can send something in on their own or call and request the ballot, but they have to do something themselves to get the ballot. It won't automatically be mailed to them. Okay? But now in the general election, because it's not a partisan primary election, they get the ballot. So everybody's in the same in the general election, which is one of the reasons for the possibility of the November option, because then everybody gets the ballot and we avoid the election in August where we have the problem with the independents not getting a ballot. Any other questions? Okay, if anybody thinks of one, we'll be here, so we'll be happy to answer them, or just discuss if you don't want to ask a question in front of the group. We'll be happy to answer it for you or provide any other information. So, Councilwoman, is there anything else you wanted to say? Or?
I just want to thank everyone that attended, and I know it is rather confusing with the independent side, so we'll be here to help answer some more questions if you have any. Thanks for coming.